So good morning, everybody. Hope you're having a fine first morning. I know some of us are been arriving very late. Some epic pilgrimages happening from different parts of Europe and the world. So hope you got at least some sleep. We're starting with something very, very exciting. I'm very pleased that Martin Puchner is here with us today. Martin and I met for the first time about, was it a year ago? More or less, maybe a little bit less. And right away we dove into the heart of things. We talked about education, the future of education, and especially in the face of artificial intelligence. And I'm very excited about this because he's really, he spent, you're going to find out in a moment, but he spent the last year or two really going deep into artificial intelligence himself, even writing little GPTs and using them philosophically and historically and culturally. And so we're going to hear from someone with first-hand experience about AI and humanities and language. But I think it's clear to everyone that we're in a shift of something very, very important through artificial intelligence. I don't think we really know yet what it means for us human beings, but it feels like a new dawn. Something new has begun in a way, and Martin is going to talk about this, but he likes it to a third humbling. The first one would be Copernicus, we're not in the center of the universe. Darwin, we're not in the center of the animal kingdom. And now we're not the only creatures with intelligence, or entities, or however you're going to call it, with intelligence. So the idea of this panel is that we're going to listen to Martin first for about 15-20 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation, and then we're going to open it to the floor for some questions. So Martin, I'm so delighted that you're here, and thank you.
Thanks, Jakob. And maybe I'll stand up so I'll project a little better. So as Jakob was just saying, I want to start by thinking a little bit about the emotional responses that I've observed to AI, both in other people and in myself. And I think it's safe to say that the first and still overwhelming response is something close to fear. Right? There are all these scenarios that are floating around in our heads and that have gotten a lot of play in the media about the disruptions AI will bring, and even more than disruptions to the workplace and other spheres, the fear that it will take over our lives. It will, become super intelligent and perhaps even eradicate humanity. So these scenarios of fear are very strong. And I think it's also clear where they come from. They come from the last 200, 250 years of science fiction. And that is, I think those are the scenarios. And I'm speaking about myself as much as about anyone else. So I think this was the first reaction, this sense of fear. There's a second reaction, perhaps the flip side to fear, which is something closer to contempt. And I found this especially in sort of my world among writers and artists, that whenever an AI was caught hallucinating, that is making something up, people were outraged and incensed and jumped on it. And here you're making this up. And really, how can you, this source doesn't exist, this thing isn't true, this reaction of contempt. Or in the case of art, this very predictable sonnet about my morning coffee cup. This is really the best you can do. There was sort of this attitude, show me AI, what you can do in terms of culture and art. And then usually there's this attitude of not being very impressed by that. So on the one hand, fear, these doomsday scenarios, fueled in part by science fiction. And on the other hand, this kind of contempt and sort of suspicion and contempt about what different AIs were actually producing. And it was, I think, that combination of reactions that reminded me, as Jakob was saying, of earlier moments when there was this sort of experience of humbling, including the first humbling, the Copernican revolution, and you all know that story, the geocentric world system being replaced by a heliocentric world system, humanity being displaced from the center, and the reactions at the time were a similar combination of fear, being very upset about this displacement, contempt, anger, outrage at the people who proposed it. So that reminded me of some of these reactions to AI. And then the second with Darwin, that humanity is not the sort of pinnacle of evolution, but that we share a kind of evolutionary process with all creatures, on all life on Earth. Now, in the case of both Copernicus and Darwin, after these initial reactions of fear and outrage and contempt, there's a second sort of wave that I want to hold on to, which is something closer to awe. Because in the case of Copernicus, people started to realize that yes, we were displaced from the center of the universe, but at the same time, this new view of the world created a vastly expanded universe, and we realized that we actually share this, there isn't a center, and that we share this peripheral position with an unbelievable number of other entities and stars and galaxies and so on and so forth. So this vastly expanded world was brought in by the Copernican revolution. And I think something similar can be said with Darwin, where instead of, yes, we weren't created by God 5,000 years ago, but suddenly we were displaced from the center perhaps, but suddenly we were part of this vastly expanded temporal horizon of evolution that went back, billions of years. So also a kind of awe at the evolutionary processes, and of which we were part. And I think that what I want to extract from those two examples is perhaps a similar sense that after these initial reactions of fear and contempt, and I'm not saying that there aren't scenarios of AI that maybe are genuinely scary or that there's nothing to worry about, nor am I saying that everything that an AI produces is always a work of genius, but I do think that we need to move beyond these two initial reactions. And I think the sense of awe that I think we humans learn to feel with respect to both Copernicus and Darwin may also be a good reaction to AI, allowing us to see that we share forms of intelligence with other entities. And the most provocative formulation I want to propose here, put in the room, is that I think often these revolutions allow us to see ourselves, us as humans, in a new light. That's most certainly the case with Copernicus, it was the case with Darwin. And I think so too, in the case of AI, it allows us, for me, what I find most interesting is what the arrival of AI allows us to see about ourselves, understanding ourselves in a new light, now that AI exists. And I think what we can see is that we humans, in a sense that I'm going to specify in a second, are artificially intelligent ourselves. So in the case of Copernicus, I think people came to see that there was a sort of a false opposition or conflict between Earth and Sun. That it wasn't, the idea that either the Sun is at the center or the Earth at the center, that was sort of a false rivalry. Even more with Darwin, that there's somehow a rivalry between primates and humans, and there are all these cartoons of Darwin with like a primate body and his head, sort of based on that opposition. Oh, you're turning us into apes. That was the reaction, and fueled by a sense of really insisting on human uniqueness. And so too, I think we are often caught in a kind of us humans versus the machines kind of thinking with AI. And what I hope this formulation that we are artificially intelligent ourselves will do is allow us to get out of that opposition and learn how we actually can interact with AI and why AI is so powerful in its relation to us. And the reason is that we are artificially intelligent ourselves. So what do I mean by that? I don't mean to say that we have computer programs in our minds. I know that there are vast differences between, OpenAI's ChatGPT and biological human bodies that we are, which is why, for example, why it's so hard to teach AI's common sense or even the laws of physics, all these things that we learn as infants. So I'm obviously aware of those differences. But I think what AI and AI's capacities show us about ourselves is that is the series of tools and technologies that we humans have devised and that have really shaped us who we are. Now, we humans have long known that we are tool users. There are some animals that use tools too, of course, but the use of tools is one of the things that turned us into who we are. And that goes from simple tools like hammers to more complicated tools. And we've also always known that their tools have there's sort of an interesting feedback loop between tools and the people who use them. There's this famous saying that to a person with a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? You've heard that, and I think that phrase is usually used to call out a kind of myopic vision, right? If you have a hammer, you know what the hammer is good for, and you're gonna look for nails everywhere. But I think there's actually a profound insight in that formulation, which is that there is this feedback loop that once we learned to use hammers, we became, in some sense, hammering humans. It allowed us to see the world through that technology. But so this notion of tool is important, but I think it's actually much too weak to describe the extent to which we have relied on technologies. And the most important one is the one that's at the center of our gathering here, namely language. So if you just think about what is happening right now, which is that just by making sounds with my vocal cords, I am changing your brains. I'm literally reaching into your brains and changing something there. I'm creating a network of minds in this room. I'm, in some sense, downloading ideas and thoughts and terms into your minds. In 5 minutes, you will remember a lot of them. If I'm lucky, in 5 hours, you'll remember still a little bit of them. But it's creating this network. And that's really what allowed humans to turn ourselves into a culture-producing species. It's an artifact. It's an artifact that really changed how we operate. If you just imagine, and many philosophers have done that over the centuries, what an isolated human growing up in isolation would be in comparison to us. And you realize it would really be a very different kind of species, not biologically, but culturally, because such a child would not be part of that network of minds that doesn't just happen in one particular space like this one, but of course then thanks to writing and other technologies, vastly expanded capacities and symbol processing powers. And that's of course exactly what AI taps into. As many of you may know, the big initial idea with Turing was basically not to follow the different science fiction scenarios that we all grew up with, beginning with Frankenstein, where there are sort of corpses sewn together and reanimated with electric shocks. That's not how an artificial intelligence actually emerged. It emerged through this reduction to symbols and words. Turing's initial model for a computer was a typewriter, right? A language and writing in symbol processing entity. And that may seem like a complete disappointment. Where are all the great humanoids that we were promised by science fiction? But that reduction actually, I think, says something very important. Namely, I would say it taps into precisely the features that make us artificially intelligent, namely language that allows us to network our minds, writing that allows us to store knowledge in different external storage devices like libraries and books and many other devices, and allows us to interact with these features with relative ease. There was, some of you may know, ELIZA, the 60s, a very early, very simple algorithm that was essentially fed with phrases from psychoanalysis or psychotherapy, a school of psychotherapy that basically just was based on mirroring what patients were saying to their analyst back to them. So it was relatively easy to construct. And what was so amazing to people at the time was that patients who were interacting with this very simple, very predictable early chatbot were very quick to impart emotional responses to ELIZA, even though they knew that it was a very simple computer program, a computer algorithm that was basically fed with these phrases. The reason I think there are lots of things to be said about that. One reason I think has to do with this therapeutic relation and transference and this dynamic. But the other has to do with how we are inducted into language, maybe through dialogue, through speech. And so we are primed to imagine that at the other end of a dialogue is another person. So in this sense, the famous Turing test is in a way much too easy, and that's become clear, I think, to lots of people in the field, is much too easy to pass, because we are actually very quick to imagine that someone with whom we are exchanging text messages is another human or has emotions or is like a human. So I would say what the Turing test really tests is not whether a computer program is intelligent, but it actually tests the extent to which we are artificially intelligent, because we are so easy to fool in some sense by these computer programs. Now, before we get into a dialogue, I want to give one more example or dimension to this idea that what AI reveals is the extent to which we are artificially intelligent because of our reliance on language and writing and other symbols and other cultural artifacts, also visual ones and so on and so forth. And that has to do with this function of dialogue. It's been fascinating to me that the way we interact with most AIs is through chat. And this term chat, it's a cutesy kind of term, and I think this is why it's sort of discouraging to think about it very deeply, because chat is this slight little, this term that seems sort of humble and funny and unimportant. But the fact that we are interacting with these chatbots, I think, is something really worth thinking about and pausing over, precisely because of the way in which it taps into our own language-based, dialogic, and writing-based intelligence. It made me go back to the history of dialogue, and in particular an episode in the ancient world that I think is hugely fascinating, when different sort of charismatic figures emerged in the ancient world. The Buddha in India, Confucius in China, Socrates in Greece. You could also include Jesus in the Near East. And what they all had in common is, well, they had two things in common. They all refused to write, even though they lived in literate societies. They insisted on doing what we are doing, namely what we are going to do in a second, namely having a live interaction, live dialogue They were really teachers. They didn't want to write down their theories, their treatises. They wanted that live interaction. But then something interesting happened. Well, something predictable happened, namely they died sooner or later. The Buddha and Confucius died of natural causes. Socrates and Jesus were killed. But then their students were faced with a very interesting dilemma. Namely, should they continue in this live dialogic mode of their teachers, or should they do precisely what their teachers told them not to do, namely to write down their words? And as all teachers know, sooner or later their students betray them and do precisely what you tell them not to do. So this is what they did, but they did that with a twist. They basically invented a new form of written dialogue. Plato, Socrates' students, is perhaps the most famous. He wrote the Platonic dialogues. But the students and followers who wrote down the words of the Buddha and of Confucius and of Jesus basically also captured their teachers in this mode of dialogue and in interaction, showing them in interaction with their followers. And so they invented this form of dialogue. So when OpenAI this January made it possible to customize GPTs, as Jakob was saying, it reminded me of this history of dialogue, that in some sense, some of the most important intellectual philosophical traditions in the world, Chinese philosophy, Indian philosophy, Western philosophy, all were based on this dialogic revolution, as we could call them. And so it's interesting that we are now that there's a new type of dialogue that's emerging between us and these chatbots. So I thought that creating chatbots based on these dialogic philosophers would be an interesting way to test that form of dialogue. So this is what I did. I've created about a dozen of these GPTs that allow you to talk to Socrates and the Buddha and so on and so forth. And it's been fascinating to see the kind of dynamic that emerged there. You basically have to define dialogic behavior. You have to really think about how these philosophers interact with their interlocutors, and then sort of refine that kind of behavior. So this is just an example of, I think, the picture that emerges from this basic assumption about our artificial intelligence, and that I think it's a better way of describing how we can now interact with these new forms of artificial intelligence that in some ways, as I keep saying, tap into the way we are acculturated to a world based on our artificial intelligence. Again, doesn't mean to say that there aren't huge differences between a chatbot and biological humans. But instead of always insisting on that difference with the idea of insisting what's sort of unique about us, I think this idea of us as artificial intelligence allows us to see how we interact, the ease with which we interact with them, and the ELIZA example shows that. And I think this idea also then throws up a bunch of interesting questions about education, about the humanities, that I think maybe we'll explore in a chat.
Thank you very much, Martin. First of all, I really appreciate the freshness of your perspective. I've not heard it or seen it put quite like that, this analysis of the similarities between the artificial intelligence that we are as human beings and the artificial intelligence that's emerging now. And yet, I want to push you a bit, especially in the differences. Mm-hmm. And I think we can maybe take as an example what you just mentioned, the Buddha and Confucius and Socrates and Jesus, the chatbots that you created. And I'd love to just get a sense from you, and in a way that's a very kind of old philosophical question, but what's the difference between chatting with the Buddha to your chat GPTs, and what's the difference of the Buddha being up here and in a way being in the room with the Buddha, and especially from the point of view of the recipient, right? So what is it that that's special about language, also in a way of catching the tones that in a way maybe can only be caught when you're in a room with someone else, the language of the body, the language of listening to the tone in someone's voice, the particular sense of the eyes, all of that, which some would argue can get lost in that chat encounter. And so I'd just like to get a bit of a sense from you of that kind of, that in a way, in philosophy it's often called, the I think it's a Chinese room argument, right? So you could know everything about water, you could know all the properties and everything, but then there's that sense of tasting it, right? Which reveals something which otherwise you couldn't have had. And I'm not sure if it's analogous, but it's interesting to me to just wonder about what's possible, and in a way what also gets left out, and what that reveals about language, about what constitutes language.
No, I think that is a great way of putting this problem or this question. And in a sense, it's precisely why the Buddha, Socrates, Jesus, Confucius, and others insisted on not using this new technology, namely writing. The other three didn't talk about it explicitly, but Socrates did. And I think his objections to writing really resonate with our worries about the internet, about AI. He said basically a version of what you just said. He was worried about, with writing, that words can very easily be taken out of context. That is, I can't ask a follow-up question, I can't ask for clarification. He didn't talk about it explicitly, but one could also say the intonations, the gestures, and there's a lot of gesturing going on here, I'm aware. All of that is lost, and he almost explicitly talked about it also in terms of fake news, namely then you detach words from the person who authors them, and you lose control. The other related worry he had had to do with what it does to our minds when we rely more and more on writing as this external memory device, and he worried that our minds would somehow atrophy, that we would be less good at remembering, we would no longer have to remember things ourselves. And I think these worries very much, the first, fake news, let's say, the second, the immense worries about smartphones and kids and attention and so on and so forth, I think are very clearly a variance of that. So all of that is true, but what's interesting about it is that the real change where that was shut off was actually not AI, but writing. Because, no one knows what the Buddha ever said. No one, it's clear in the Buddha's case that there were oral traditions, but the written versions were hundreds of years after the Buddha's life. We don't even know exactly when the Buddha lived. In the case of Plato and Jesus, say, the written versions appeared somewhat faster, but also, famously in the case of Jesus, no one who wrote the Gospels had personal memory of Jesus. And yes, Plato was a student of Socrates, but it's also clear that with the exception perhaps of the Apology, the first of Plato's dialogues, that Plato basically used Socrates as a mouthpiece for his own philosophy. So in any case, the big change happened with the switch to writing. None of us have ever had interactions with the living people, but we had those of us who have read Plato or the Buddhist sutras have had very intense relationships to these texts, to these dialogic texts. And so that difference from a real embodied human to a text seems to be much larger than basically reanimating the text through a dialogic interface, the way we can now do with AI, and you could almost say that it returns it a little closer to that original form of interaction. Just to add, I actually asked my Buddha chatbot that question. I said, who are you? Are you the Buddha? And I was sort of, it's funny how I would love to hear your reactions. I find myself sometimes being sort of rude to these chatbots, and then I feel guilty, and then I'm very polite. And in this case, I think I wanted to kind of call him out a little bit. I was sort of hoping, said, yes, I'm the Buddha. But no, the chatbot answered actually very interestingly. He said, are you an avatar of the Buddha? And said, no, I'm not an avatar of the Buddha. An avatar in Indian philosophy is the incarnation of a god or a supernatural being in a human or animal form. I'm not that. Think of me as a bridge between you and the Buddha. And that's, as you probably know, it's a famous metaphor, Buddhist metaphor. Anyway, so that's what the Buddha chatbot answered.
Yeah, it's very poetic. And maybe we can take that as a jump-off point to think about education a little bit, because I know you are, you're a professor at Harvard, and we've been talking a little bit about this too, about what really does the advent of AI mean to education, and to what does it do to those spaces. And I think the work you're doing is important, because I think it's important to define or to get a real sense of the quality of the intelligence that artificial intelligence is, and what that reveals about our own intelligence, which is exactly the core of what you're doing. And so I guess the hope, you could say, might be that a new education is in a way before us or ahead of us. And the character of this new education is that artificial intelligence is going to do a lot of things for us that you could say in a way hide our own uniqueness from us, right? So it's going to do the things, and I'll let you define it better in a moment, but something along the lines of the more mechanistic, kind of rational, even all those parts of the human animal that AI is, I think, very good at coming in and substituting or mapping or improving very quickly. Professions such as law, I think, just talking to a friend in architecture, a lot of these things which can be where humans are busy mapping out structures and defining these structures, and then entering them and didactically, rationally. And so let's just assume for a moment that in some sense artificial intelligence is going to enter that field, and maybe actually one day we will mostly rely on that. And then there's a lot of questions that happen with that, also macroeconomically, which we're not going to go into, what that's going to mean about jobs and the economy. But I think let's stick with education for the moment. What might an education look like that in a way assumes that certain parts of our intelligence are not as relevant anymore, are not as necessary, needed? And there's nothing wrong with continuing these disciplines, and humans are free to do so. But maybe there's an opening towards something new. Maybe the question would be, education can in a way rethink itself freely again. You could almost say go back to a kind of antiquity model, a model of the polis, where it really mattered to go to these education places, and you would sit and discuss the old philosophical questions of, what's a good life? What does it mean to be a human being? In a way, reflecting about consciousness, right? Reflecting about what it's like to be an embodied creature in this world, which you could say has somewhat left education, right? We've become more hard skill based, silo type spaces of education, particular advances of knowledge at the expense of a kind of holistic education. So this is a very large question, and feel free to only take parts of it. But I'm wondering if there's a kind of, at the grace of AI, in a way, enables a new kind of education that reveals something about our uniqueness, and sort of enters a new paradigm, and sort of fueled by artificial intelligence, we can actually re-meet some of our humanity, re-meet some of our conscious grace.
I think that's so true, and I think this is what you've been doing with the Alpine Fellowship, exactly that. So I think that, give you one concrete example with writing, writing education, teaching students how to write is sort of a crucial skill, and you can use it as a kind of skill-based goal. All professions need good writing. That's what employers say. Employers say they need three things, and they're always harping on the fact that we in universities are not providing them with students or graduates who are good enough at that. One is, data-driven thinking and analysis. The second is EQ, emotional intelligence, allows you to do teamwork and so on and so forth. And the third is writing. So now with AI, we could say, of course, AI will do a lot of writing for us and summarizing and reading. So what does that mean? It means that I think we need to teach students how to use AI to write, but we also need to think very hard. We are forced to think about which parts of writing can we not outsource to AI, because I think everyone in this room knows that there's a kind of technical informational writing where you just try to get information across, or you summarize something, and AI, while not perfect, is very good at those things. But there's the kind of exploratory writing where you are slowly trying to figure out in the process of writing and struggling both with sentences, with structures, with paragraphs, where in that process you're slowly clarifying your thoughts. And that writing, clearly we can't outsource. And so I think that is sort of one concrete example, just in terms of writing. And I think that goes through education more generally, where we, the only thing I would say is that somehow, how should I put this? The way you formulated it sounded like AI is going to do a lot of sort of technical stuff and my example, I guess, goes in the same direction. AI is going to do a lot of technical stuff for us, freeing us or forcing us to think really about all the things it's not good at. And I think that's true. But that formulation, again, imagines a kind of opposition. And I've been interested in thinking about moments when AI is creative. And one key term is hallucinations. Everyone uses hallucination as this terrible thing AI is doing. It's true, when you look for technical information or facts, then hallucination, when AI makes stuff up, is bad. But for the kinds of things that we are interested in, it seems like hallucination is kind of cool, where AIs invent things, and yes, based on probabilistic algorithms, and we haven't talked much about predictability. It's, I think, another term where we're very quick to say, well, what AI has produced, it's just probabilistic calculations and so on and so forth. It's true, though a lot of things that we do is also probabilistic, though in a different way. But in any case, I think it's also interesting to think about how with AI, there is a, let's say, co-creation of art, of creativity, the way we also have learned to accept it with different kinds of tools. So that's, I would always want to keep that also in the back of my mind, and I haven't quite, I'm not quite figured out how to do both of these things at the same time.
Thank you very much, Martin Puchner, for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you all.